Have you ever seen a courtroom fall silent not because of a judge's gavel but because of a single trembling voice that carried more truth than every lawyer in the room combined? That's exactly what happened on a day no one inside that courthouse will ever forget, and by the time I finish telling you this story, you'll understand why. But before we dive into this unbelievable moment, I want you to pause for a second, because stories like this one, stories that make you cry, cheer, and sit on the edge of your seat at the same time, come alive on this channel every single day. So go ahead and hit that subscribe button right now, turn on the notifications, and join a community of people who love hearing stories that prove the impossible can happen. Now, let's step inside that courtroom together. Imagine rows of wooden benches filled with people, some strangers, some family members, and a few reporters who had shown up expecting nothing more than an ordinary legal battle. The air smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood, heavy with the weight of decades of cases that had passed through those walls. On one side of the room sat a woman who looked far older than her years, her eyes tired from countless sleepless nights, her clothes modest but clean, her hands clutching a stack of papers that she had read over and over without truly understanding them. She wasn't a criminal, she wasn't a troublemaker. She was just a mother trying to survive in a system that often seemed designed to break people like her. And across from her sat polished lawyers in suits worth more than her rent, their briefcases filled with documents, their faces calm and confident because they believed they had already won before the trial even began. But what they didn't know, what none of them could have predicted, was that the most important person in that courtroom that day wasn't the judge, wasn't the jury, wasn't even the mother herself. It was her son, a little black boy barely 12 years old, whose heart burned with more courage than any adult in the room. He had been silent until that moment, sitting beside his mom, his feet barely reaching the floor, his small hands gripping a folder so tightly his knuckles turned white. When the judge asked the mother who would be speaking for her defense, she lowered her eyes in shame, because she had no attorney, no money, no one to fight for her. But then the boy stood up. He adjusted the oversized jacket that clearly belonged to someone older, took a deep breath, and with a voice that was steady despite the tremor in his chest, he said words that sent a ripple through the entire room, "Your Honor. I'm my mom's lawyer." At first, the silence was broken only by muffled chuckles from the opposing attorneys, men who thought this was some kind of joke, an insult to the court. But their laughter died quickly when they saw the look in the boy's eyes. Not playful, not naive, but determined, fiery, unshakable. The judge, a man who had spent decades presiding over countless trials, leaned forward on his bench, adjusting his glasses, not with annoyance but with curiosity. He had seen many things in his career, but never this. "Proceed," he said after a long pause, his voice calm but his eyes sharp, watching this boy carefully. And in that single moment, the entire courtroom shifted. The weight of expensive suits and polished legal jargon no longer felt as powerful as the truth that was about to pour from the lips of a child who simply refused to let his mother stand alone. The story of how that little boy ended up standing in front of a judge, declaring himself his mother's lawyer, began long before that day in the courtroom. To everyone else, he looked like just another kid, skinny, shy, a bit too quiet for his age, but behind those wide eyes was a mind sharper than anyone had given him credit for, and a heart stronger than anyone expected. His mother had been battling a case for months, a case that threatened to take away not only her home but also the stability she had worked so hard to give her only child. She had tried everything, knocking on law offices, pleading with attorneys, and filling out forms that seemed written in another language. Every time she walked out of an office, she walked out with a heavier heart, because each lawyer told her the same thing: "We can help, but it will cost you." And the cost was always more than she could ever dream of paying. Night after night, she would sit at the small kitchen table, stacks of documents spread in front of her, her head resting in her hands as tears slipped down her cheeks. And every night, that little boy would sit nearby, pretending to do homework but really just watching his mother break a little more. One evening, unable to hold it in, he asked her why she didn't just give up. Her answer was simple yet devastating. "Because if I give up, they win, and we lose everything." He never forgot those words. From that moment on, something inside him shifted. While other kids were playing ball in the streets or glued to video games, he began spending his free time buried in books. He discovered the local library had shelves filled with law texts, guides, and even case studies. At first, the words were confusing, tangled in legal jargon meant for professionals. But he didn't stop. He asked the librarian questions, borrowed dictionaries, and even watched videos of courtroom trials online late into the night when his mom thought he was asleep. Slowly, painfully, but with determination, he began to piece together the puzzle. He taught himself the difference between motions and objections, learned what due process meant, and even memorized certain rights that were often overlooked by people who didn't know the law. His mother begged him to stop, saying it wasn't his burden to carry, that he should be living his childhood instead of drowning in law books. But every time, he looked at her and said softly but firmly, "If I don't do this, then who will?" He didn't want to see her cry anymore. He didn't want to sit quietly while strangers in expensive suits tore apart the only family he had. So he studied harder. By the time the court date arrived, he had prepared notes, highlighted sections, and rehearsed arguments in front of a cracked mirror in their small apartment. The morning of the trial, he dressed in a borrowed suit jacket that was too big for his frame, the sleeves hanging past his wrists, but his posture was tall, his chin lifted with pride. When his mother tried to tell him not to come forward, he simply smiled and whispered, "Mom, you've fought for me my whole life. Now it's my turn to fight for you." And as he stood before the judge that day, those words rang in his heart like a promise he refused to break. The courtroom didn't quite know how to react when the boy began to speak, because in that space, words were currency, and usually only the most educated or the most expensive voices were heard. But here was this child, barely tall enough to see over the table, his small fingers clutching a stack of papers filled with notes written in uneven handwriting, and yet the conviction in his voice was something no one could dismiss. At first, the opposing attorneys smirked, whispering to one another, confident that this was a waste of time, a spectacle that would collapse under the weight of real law. But as the boy's voice grew steadier, as his eyes locked not on the lawyers but directly on the judge, something began to shift in the room. He started by telling the story of his mother, not with flowery language, not with legal polish, but with honesty so sharp it cut through every layer of arrogance in that chamber. He described how she worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table, how she came home exhausted but still stayed up late to help him with homework, how she never asked for charity but only for fairness. Then, with a deep breath, he opened his notes and began to cite specific laws and cases. The room stirred. This wasn't just a child crying for sympathy, this was someone who had done his homework. He quoted sections about tenant rights, about equal protection, about the legal requirement that the court consider the human impact of decisions, not just the financial arguments presented by the wealthy. His voice trembled at times, but whenever it did, he steadied himself by glancing at his mother, who sat frozen, tears filling her eyes as she realized her son had become her defender in ways she could never have imagined. Even the judge leaned forward, his expression thoughtful, his pen tapping slowly against the desk as if taking in every word. And then the boy did something that silenced the last of the laughter in the room. He turned toward the lawyers on the other side and, in a tone both respectful and piercing, asked, "Do you really believe the law was written to punish people like my mom, or was it written to protect them?" The question hung in the air like thunder. The attorneys shifted uncomfortably, because no polished rebuttal could erase the truth in those words. He wasn't just arguing facts, he was forcing everyone in that courtroom to confront their own humanity. Even the jury, who had been passive up until that point, were leaning in now, their eyes fixed on him as though they too were part of something much larger than a trial. It wasn't just about winning or losing anymore, it was about whether justice could still exist in a world where money usually determined the outcome. And the boy, with every shaky breath, with every determined word, was proving that courage could outweigh wealth, that truth spoken from the heart could pierce through walls built of arrogance and power. The judge, a man who had spent decades behind the bench, had seen countless cases. Greedy corporations, bitter divorces, tragic criminal trials, but as he sat watching this boy, he realized something rare was happening, something that broke through the routine of law and order. It wasn't just that the child knew his facts, it was the way he spoke them. His words carried no arrogance, no hidden agenda, only raw truth and love for his mother. And in that courtroom, where arguments were usually cold and calculated, that truth carried more weight than gold. As he continued, he lifted a page with shaky hands and pointed out inconsistencies in the opposing counsel's claims, referencing specific lines in contracts that his mother had been pressured to sign without understanding their meaning. The room erupted in whispers. How could a 12-year-old spot what trained professionals had overlooked? The lawyers tried to object, but their voices cracked with frustration, because the boy's arguments were not only emotionally powerful but factually accurate. Each time they tried to dismiss him, the judge raised a hand and said, "Let him continue." The boy then turned back to the judge and said something that no one in the room expected. "Your Honor, my mom always tells me the law is supposed to protect people. But if she loses today, then what is the law protecting? The people with money? Or the people who need it the most?" The silence that followed was unlike anything that Courtroom had ever experienced. Even the stenographer, who had typed through thousands of testimonies, paused for a split second, her fingers frozen above the keys. His mother buried her face in her hands, not out of shame but out of overwhelming pride and disbelief. She had come into that courtroom prepared to lose everything, but now, watching her son, she realized she had already won something greater. She had raised a child brave enough to fight for her. The jury members exchanged glances, some of them visibly emotional, their eyes misting as they listened to a child demand fairness from a system that so often forgot compassion. The opposing attorneys, who had walked into that courtroom with smug confidence, now sat stiff, their faces pale, realizing that their usual tactics weren't working. No clever wording, no polished tone, no expensive degree could outshine the sincerity of that boy's plea. And as his final words of that speech echoed through the chamber, "If you were me, wouldn't you fight for your mom too?" The judge leaned back in his chair, his hand pressed against his mouth, struggling to maintain the stoic composure his role demanded. Deep down, however, everyone could see it. The boy had already changed the outcome of this trial, not because of the law written on paper, but because he had reminded everyone why the law existed in the first place. When the time finally came for the verdict, the atmosphere in that courtroom was unlike anything anyone there had ever experienced before. It wasn't just a case anymore, it was a test of conscience. The jury returned to their seats, their expressions unreadable, but the silence in the room was so thick it felt like even the walls were holding their breath. The boy held his mother's hand tightly, his small fingers wrapping around hers with a grip far stronger than his size suggested. She whispered to him, "No matter what happens, I'm proud of you," and he whispered back, "We're going to win, Mom. I know it." The judge cleared his throat, and in a steady voice began to read the decision. With each sentence, the boy's heart pounded faster, until finally, the words came that changed everything. The court ruled in favor of his mother. She would keep her home, her rights were protected, and the opposing counsel, despite all their money, power, and confidence, had lost to a 12-year-old boy who refused to stay silent. For a moment, the room was utterly still, and then, slowly, people began to smile, to nod, even to clap softly in quiet admiration. The boy's mother broke down in tears, pulling him into her arms, whispering over and over, "Thank you, my son, thank you." Reporters who had been there for what they thought would be an ordinary case rushed to capture the story, their cameras flashing, their pens scribbling furiously, because they knew they had just witnessed something extraordinary. Word of the trial spread beyond that courthouse, beyond that city, reaching people all over the country and even the world. News headlines called him the boy lawyer, the young defender, and the son who defeated the system. Interviews poured in, offers of scholarships and support flooded their small apartment, but the boy, in his quiet way, brushed it all aside. He wasn't interested in fame. All he cared about was that his mother could finally rest, could finally sleep without fear, could finally hold her head high knowing that she had not been crushed by a system designed to break her. And when people asked him how he managed to do it, he always gave the same answer, "Because she's my mom, and I wasn't going to let anyone take her away from me." That was his truth. That was his power. And it's a story that continues to inspire countless others today, proving that courage doesn't come with age, that love is the strongest weapon we'll ever have, and that even in the darkest rooms, one small voice can change everything. So if this story touched you, if it made you believe even for a moment that justice is still alive and love can still win, then make sure you subscribe to this channel right now. Because tomorrow, I'll bring you another story that just might change the way you see the world forever.